Hello, everyone. This video lecture will cover external causes. In addition to the cause of an injury, like a fall or what have you, we also need to be aware of the guidelines covering the place, the activity, and the status, meaning work status of the patient when the event occurred. Let's have a closer look. And as we talked about, this covers external causes of morbidity. So these are codes that start with V00 and go all the way through Y99. These include such things as transport accidents, V00 through V99, slips, stumbling, falls, W00 through W19, exposure to inanimate and animate mechanical forces, W20 through W49 and W50 through W64, exposure to smoke, fire, and flames, X00 through X08. X10 through X19 covers contact with heat and hot surfaces. X71 through X83, intentional self-harm. And X92 through Y08 is assault. And we get into a lot of finer details in this chapter. So please make it a point to read your guidelines. They're outlined, and I've highlighted some of the ones in your text that I think you should pay special attention to. These get very, very involved. Your textbook does a great job of laying out some of these things, and I would recommend focusing on some of the ones that are outlined with these light bulbs. For example, no external cause code can be assigned as a principal, first listed, or only listed diagnosis. And the use of external codes, cause codes, are optional for physicians in healthcare facilities unless there's a state-based mandatory reporting, such as in California. We also get into, in addition to the fall or other mechanical cause of an injury, we also, for the initial encounter only, need to code the place of occurrence, the activity that somebody was doing when they had the injury, and the external cause status, status meaning their employment. So these are only used for the initial encounter. A good acronym to remember that is as follows. P, place. A, activity. And S, status. Pay attention to the past, but only on the initial encounter, which is going to have the last character of A, as we've seen before. In ICD-10, the external cause codes will always start with the letters V, W, X, or Y. These are considered to be additional diagnoses. So in other words, we would follow a diagnosis code of a fracture from another chapter to indicate how the injury or condition occurred. These codes capture the external cause of injury or health. So again, we talk about the place where the event occurred, the activity that they were doing, and the status meaning employment, whether it's civilian, military, something done for recreation, what have you. Important guideline and this is also in your text, an external cause code can never be the principal, first listed, or only diagnosis. Why? Because the intent of these is that they are going to capture the additional diagnosis codes. They're going to follow the fracture to indicate how the fracture occurred. An external cause code, therefore, must be a secondary code. It has to follow a diagnosis code. And while they say they are optional, most states are requiring this to be reported. And this is where the national traffic safety data comes from, is from these types of codes. In California, these are mandatory. So Y92 is the place of occurrence of the external cause, and it's used with the activity code. The activity code indicates what they were doing at the time the injury occurred. And then finally, the Y99 category code identifies external cause status of person. Status meaning their work status, what they were doing for a living, whether they were injured while they were a student, doing recreation, what have you. There are some chapter-specific guidelines. They're in the front of this chapter, and they cover such things as place, activity, status, of course. And if the reporting format limits the number of external cause codes, what you should do, please pay close attention to these guidelines. And there are sequencing guidelines. There are important guidelines on child and adult abuse that are used for a lot of different services, research, what have you. We even have guidelines on terrorism and other external cause status. Sometimes a patient's diagnosis will be coded from Chapter 19, injury, poisoning, and other consequences, such as suicides, what have you. External cause codes can be used with a code from another chapter. So if we have a poisoning, we don't need to cover an external cause because it's already embedded in that poisoning code. We talked about the letters that these codes begin with. And many, but not all of these codes require a seventh character. And there are old friends, an A, initial encounter, D, subsequent encounter, S is sequela. And again, we can only have these at the for these external cause. So it's A, D, or S as indicated. Let's take a look at an example of one in your text. So let's take a look at example 1. Patient was injured when he was kicked by another person in a fight and brought to the emergency department. So we know that we're going to have the main term kicked by, subterm person, subterm in a fight. The code would be Y04.0XXA. Let's take a look at 2 now and follow along in your code books. Patient was assaulted by another person who had shot the patient with a handgun, and the patient was brought to the ER. Main term, assault. Subterm, firearm. Subterm, handgun, and the code is X093.XXA. Note the A for the initial encounter. Let's take a look at one more, and that is patient was diving into a swimming pool and got injured when he struck the bottom and was brought to the emergency department for treatment. The main term out of the table of external causes, diving, accident diving, fall into water in a swimming pool, striking bottom, So again, striking the bottom end, subterm swimming pool, we have W16.022 initial encounter. Again, we see the A. ICD-10-CM has an external cause index, and this is where you find all of these codes. The entries and the main terms are accident, drowning, exposure, falling, slipping. Let's take a look at the external cause index, or as some refer to it as the table. By this time in the course, you are, of course, familiar with the index to injuries and diseases. So looking past that, again, looking past that, sorry about that, we can see this. Everybody's familiar with this as a place where you find main terms. Well, now we're going to see some of those terms, but just applied to external cause in a similar index. Okay, we can see this. 1 second. Somebody was talking to me the other day and mentioned that it's a table. It really isn't a table. Think of it as kind of an alphabetic index, except it's dealing with external causes. So you can see things like abuse, accident, and others. And this is where you need to start. And you'll notice also that they have little check marks. And then again, there are other entries that you would use in that index to look up the activity, the place, and the status. Some of the status examples include such things as civilian, recreation or leisure, student, what have you. More main terms. Any of these are great places to find these codes. These include accidents, exposure, drowning, and of course, the last 3 bullet points for the activity, place, and status. And some of these, as you'll see, don't make a whole lot of sense. And there's some funny stuff on the internet I wanted to share with you about this. This was put out by a physician blog called Single Care, and they had a list of some of the more ridiculous ICD-10 codes, and these do actually exist. Spacecraft collision injuring an occupant. Maybe Jeff Bezos will be involved in that. I really like number 2, problems with the in-laws. I'm not going to officially comment on that. Has anybody ever injured themselves while performing in an opera house? Or maybe something that's worth coding and classifying is a burnt due to water skis on fire. Of course, that would be the initial encounter. Oddly enough, though, we could be sucked into a jet engine and have a subsequent encounter. I don't know of anybody, and have never heard of anyone or anything that actually survived getting sucked into a jet engine. But as you've noticed by this time in the course, ICD-10 seems to have a code for even things that don't necessarily exist. And again, the sequence of the place, activity, and status, we can only have one place of occurrence. We don't use the unspecified code of Y92.9 if the place of occurrence is not stated. It's odd. I know it doesn't make sense. I know some people are going to comment on this. I don't write the coding guidelines. I'm just here to teach them. So these are used with injury codes and for any activities that are due to the long-term cumulative effects, such as those from chapter 13. But you can only have one place of occurrence of the event. Y93 codes are the activity that follows the place, right? Back to our PAS acronym. And these are used in conjunction for the cause and intent if identifying the activity provides additional information. If it doesn't, don't use it. And these codes are used with the code for the external cause status and place of occurrence. As with the place, they're only used at the initial encounter. And you can only have one activity at a time. And as we saw with place, we don't assign Y93.9 unspecified activity if the activity is not stated in the documentation. And here's some activities that and main terms that you can find: walking, running. So you'd look activity, walking, running, ice, snow, caregiving, playing musical instruments, what have you. Y99, the status is assigned whenever you have the other external causes. And again, we don't apply these to poisoning, adverse effects, surgical misadventures, any other late effects. Y99 is not assigned if no other external cause codes, in other words, cause activity, are assigned. These external cause status codes are only used once at the initial encounter. Only one status. So if you have a student who's working and going to school, as many of you do, you can't have more than these. You pick only one. And as we saw with place and activity, we don't use the unspecified external cause status. The seventh character must always be in the seventh position, as we've seen in other chapters. If we have a code that requires a seventh character and it's not 6 characters long, a placeholder X must be used to fill it in so we can reach that 7th slot. We can have multiple first listed encounters. So there's a hierarchy, and it is as follows. External codes, for child and adult abuse take priority over all other external cause codes. Terrorism takes precedence and priority over all other external codes except child and adult abuse. Cataclysmic events like earthquakes, hurricanes, what have you, take priority over everything except terrorism and child and adult abuse, since child and adult abuse takes priority over all other external cause codes. Traffic accidents then follow, and traffic accidents take precedence over any other causal external cause codes. Transport accidents are relegated below the cataclysmic events external cause, the terrorism events external cause codes, and the child and adult abuse external cause codes. Again, as we mentioned, the external cause codes for child and adult abuse is X92 through Y08. And if the perpetrator is known, we use the Y07. Let's take an example, take a look at that in the code book, for an example. So here's what we're talking about, Y07. Right, we have the Y04, assault by bodily force, human bite, all different types of things. We also have a category for Y07. In other words, who is the perpetrator of the assault, maltreatment, or neglect? Note what we have here. Could be a spouse. And specifically, since we have to go to a fifth character, it could be husband, wife, male partner, female partner, and so on. Going down here to Y08, assault by other specified means, assault by a hockey stick, baseball bat, crashing of aircraft. All those are assaults. I'm going to stop here. Tune in for our next video lecture where we'll continue to talk about external cause coding.